When people hear the word billionaire, they immediately imagine someone constantly investing, chasing markets, analyzing stocks, and making aggressive financial moves. But this billionaire did the opposite, and that contradiction confused everyone around him for years. Because while others talked endlessly about portfolios and returns, he stayed quiet, almost detached, as if those conversations had nothing to do with him. At first, people assumed he was hiding something, that there were secret funds or complex structures operating in the background. But the truth was far simpler and far more unsettling. He genuinely did not invest money the way most people define investing. And what made this even harder to understand was that his wealth kept growing anyway. Not explosively or through lucky bets, but steadily, predictably, and with far less volatility than anyone else in his circle. That contradiction forced those close to him to confront an uncomfortable question. How could someone accumulate enormous wealth without actively investing in the markets everyone else depended on? And the answer had nothing to do with intelligence or risk tolerance, but everything to do with how he defined investment in the first place. To him, investing money was never the primary lever, it was the last one, something you do only after everything else is already positioned correctly. And most people, he believes, start from the wrong end, focusing obsessively on where to put money, instead of where money is leaking, a mistake that quietly destroys leverage. While others poured capital into external opportunities, he reinvested time into building structures that didn't require constant funding to survive. Businesses designed to generate cash consistently, scale without burning resources, and function even when conditions turned unfavorable. And what looked like caution from the outside was actually insulation. He didn't want returns that depended on perfect timing or favorable markets. He wanted systems that worked regardless of conditions. And while others diversified portfolios, he diversified sources of leverage, building models where customers funded growth, expenses scaled slower than revenue, and failure in one area never threatened the entire structure. Money, in his view, was a byproduct, not a tool. An idea that sounded absurd in environments obsessed with financial optimization. But over time, results made the argument for him, especially during downturns, when others panicked and watched their investments shrink while his wealth remained largely unaffected, not because he predicted the collapse, but because his exposure was limited from the beginning. He explained it once in a sentence that stuck with those who heard it. Investing money assumes you already have control, but most people invest to feel in control. And that difference creates vulnerability, because the moment you need returns, you surrender leverage. Instead of chasing performance, he chased optionality, designing his life so he was never forced to invest, never pressured by idle capital, and never dependent on market timing, avoiding debt that demanded constant servicing, business models that burned cash, and investments that required attention without delivering control. What made him different wasn't restraint, it was clarity. He understood that money amplifies whatever structure it enters, and if the structure is fragile, more money only accelerates collapse. So he delayed investing, not out of fear, but out of discipline, waiting until opportunities met his criteria rather than lowering his standards to fit the moment. Over time, this approach created something rare, a position where capital flowed toward him naturally instead of being deployed desperately. And that position is what eventually made him a billionaire. Even though people didn't realize it at first, they stopped asking why he wasn't investing and started asking how he always seemed to have leverage when others didn't, without realizing that the answer was hidden in plain sight all along. Not in what he did with his money, but in how long he refused to touch it. And as more people tried to copy his results by imitating surface-level behavior, they missed the deeper principle guiding every decision he made. A principle that challenges almost everything people believe about investing, risk, and wealth. What most people never understood was that his refusal to invest wasn't passive. It was strategic, because while others were busy reacting to markets, trends, and headlines, he was designing a position where reaction was never required, and the difference quietly compounded over time. He believed that the most dangerous moment for any investor is not when things are going badly, but when things are going well, because success creates pressure to deploy capital quickly, to chase momentum, and to justify action, even when action isn't necessary. And that pressure is what leads people to make decisions they wouldn't make if they weren't afraid of missing out. By refusing to invest prematurely, he protected himself from urgency. And without urgency, clarity became possible, allowing him to see opportunities, not as chances to win big, but as structures to be evaluated calmly based on resilience rather than excitement. When he finally did invest, it never looked like what others expected. There were no dramatic announcements, no bold predictions, and no emotional commitment, just quiet moves into situations where downside was controlled, upside was asymmetric, and time worked in his favor. Ironically, this restraint made him more aggressive than most because he could afford to wait. And waiting is a form of power most people underestimate, especially in environments where constant activity is rewarded socially but punished financially. He watched people around him burn through capital not because they were careless, but because they were impatient, mistaking motion for progress and exposure for bravery, while he stayed positioned on the sidelines, insulated, liquid, and unpressured. Over years, this approach shaped not just his finances but his psychology. He became comfortable doing nothing while others rushed, comfortable being misunderstood, and comfortable missing opportunities that didn't meet his standards, knowing that preserving optionality mattered more than short-term gains. Eventually, his wealth reached a scale where people assumed investing must be his primary activity. But by then, investing was almost irrelevant because the systems he had built generated capital continuously, without requiring constant decisions or attention. Money flowed to him not because he chased it, but because he had built environments where it naturally accumulated. Environments defined by control, flexibility, and low fragility. Qualities rarely discussed in traditional investment conversations. When asked why he never talked about investing, he once replied that most people talk about investing because they don't have systems, and systems remove the need for constant financial decisions. A statement that unsettled many, because it challenged the belief that wealth comes from clever bets rather than careful design. The truth was that he never avoided investing, he avoided dependency on markets, on timing, on conditions he couldn't control, and by avoiding dependency, he avoided panic, allowing him to think long-term when others couldn't see past the next quarter. This mindset didn't make him immune to mistakes, but it made mistakes survivable. And survivability, he believed, was the real foundation of wealth, because only those who stay in the game long enough benefit from compounding. Looking back, he realized that his greatest advantage wasn't intelligence or foresight, but the willingness to delay gratification in a world obsessed with immediacy, to resist pressure in a culture that rewards visibility, and to prioritize durability over excitement. Most people will never follow this path, not because it's impossible, but because it feels uncomfortable, boring, and counterintuitive, and because doing less when everyone else is doing more feels like falling behind, even when it's actually positioning you ahead. His story spread quietly, not through headlines, but through results. And those who understood it stopped asking what he invested in and started asking how he built a life that didn't require constant financial decisions. In the end, the irony was impossible to ignore. The billionaire who never invested money ended up richer than many who dedicated their lives to investing, not because investing is flawed, but because investing without leverage, control, and patience is fragile. And the real lesson wasn't that investing is unnecessary, but that investing is powerful only when it comes after structure, after insulation, and after optionality are already in place. Because wealth isn't created by how often you act, but by how rarely you're forced to. And the billionaire who never invested understood that the greatest return of all is the ability to wait while the world rushes past you.